Miles Carter never expected his life to change on the first day of camp. At 30 feet, the towering, muscular camp monitor was used to keeping his distance, until Dylan Hayes arrived. Blonde, blue-eyed, and irresistibly magnetic, the 20-year-old stirred something in Miles he couldn't ignore. A single glance was all it took. Sparks flew across the campgrounds, their unspoken connection growing stronger with every stolen look. Miles knew it was forbidden, but how could he resist? Dylan noticed too, and one daring night, he made a bold move. What happened in that tent would break every rule and change their lives forever. Would their connection survive the end of summer? Or was one unforgettable night all they were destined to share? The sun blazed over Camp Riverbend as Miles Carter adjusted his camp leader badge, preparing for the arrival of the new participants. He had done this for years, welcoming campers, giving them the lay of the land, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. But this summer felt different, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Standing by the main lodge, his tall frame and commanding presence naturally drew eyes, but Miles's focus was on his duties. At least, it was, until Dylan Hayes stepped off the bus. Miles felt his breath catch. Dylan was the embodiment of youthful energy and charm, his blonde hair shining in the sunlight, his blue eyes scanning the campgrounds with a mixture of curiosity and excitement. He carried himself with a confidence that seemed almost out of place for a first-timer, and yet it felt entirely his own. For a moment, Miles froze, his usual composed demeanor faltering as he found himself staring. Dylan noticed. Their eyes locked, and a subtle smirk played on Dylan's lips. He tilted his head slightly, as if silently acknowledging the moment. Miles quickly averted his gaze, heat rising to his face. He busied himself greeting other campers, but his thoughts kept returning to Dylan. Something about that brief connection unsettled him in ways he hadn't experienced before. The day passed in a blur of activity, assigning cabins, leading introductions, and organizing group activities. Miles kept his interactions professional, but every time Dylan was nearby, he felt the weight of his presence. Dylan seemed to linger just within Miles's periphery, his laughter ringing out during team games, his smile lighting up the mess hall. When evening fell, the campers gathered around the fire pit for the traditional welcome ceremony. Miles stood to the side, watching as they shared stories and laughter under the starlit sky. Dylan sat across the fire, his face glowing in the flickering light, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met again. This time, it was Miles who held the gaze, unable to look away. Dylan's expression softened, and he offered a small, knowing smile. It wasn't just polite or friendly, it was deliberate. Miles's heart pounded in his chest. He told himself it was nothing, a harmless moment, but deep down, he knew better. There was something undeniable in the way Dylan looked at him, something that mirrored his own thoughts and feelings. As the campers dispersed to their tents for the night, Miles lingered by the fire, staring into the dying embers. His mind raced with questions. What was he doing? Why couldn't he shake this feeling? Just as he stood to leave, he heard footsteps approaching. Turning, he saw Dylan standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. "Good night, Mr. Carter," Dylan said, his voice low and smooth. There was a teasing edge to his tone, as if he knew the effect he had. Miles nodded, his throat dry, and watched as Dylan walked away, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the cool night air. Miles returned to his tent, his heart still racing. The rules were clear, boundaries must be respected, professionalism maintained. But as he lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling, one thought consumed him. Dylan Hayes was no ordinary camper, and this was no ordinary summer. The line between right and wrong was already beginning to blur. The first full day of camp dawned bright and early. Miles stepped out of his tent into the crisp morning air, his senses alert to the sounds of campers stirring and birds chirping in the trees. He made his usual rounds, checking on the other monitors and ensuring breakfast preparations were underway. But his focus wavered when he spotted Dylan across the dining area. Dylan stood with a group of other young campers, his golden hair catching the morning light, his laughter carrying easily through the crowd. Miles told himself to look away, to redirect his attention to anything else, but it was impossible. There was an ease in Dylan's movements, a natural confidence that drew him in like a magnet. When Dylan turned and caught Miles watching, the younger man's lips curled into that same knowing smile from the night before. Miles quickly busied himself, talking to another monitor and pretending the interaction hadn't rattled him. Still, he felt the heat of Dylan's gaze lingering on him, even as he moved through the crowd. It wasn't just the attraction that unsettled him, it was the intensity of it, the way it seemed to override the logical part of his brain that warned him to keep his distance. As the day progressed, the campers split into groups for activities. Miles led a team through the ropes course, his booming voice offering encouragement and direction. To his surprise, or perhaps not, Dylan was assigned to his group. The younger man approached with a casual air, his bright blue eyes scanning Miles with an openness that bordered on daring. "Looks like I'm with you today," Dylan said, his tone light but laced with something deeper. Miles nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Let's make sure everyone stays safe and has a good time." Throughout the course, Dylan's presence was impossible to ignore. He tackled the challenges with enthusiasm, often looking back at Miles as if seeking approval. When it was Dylan's turn to climb the wall, he paused halfway, his muscles straining as he looked down at Miles below. "Think you can give me a hand if I fall?" Dylan called out, his voice playful. Miles felt a wave of heat rush through him, but he forced himself to keep his tone steady. "You've got this, Dylan. No need to fall." Dylan smirked, pulling himself over the top with ease, but Miles caught the flicker of satisfaction in his expression. He wasn't imagining it. Dylan was testing him, teasing him, and Miles was dangerously close to failing the test. That evening, the camp gathered for a group hike to watch the sunset. Miles stayed near the back, ensuring no one lagged behind, but Dylan found a way to position himself nearby. As the group reached the lookout point, Dylan stood a few feet away, the golden hues of the setting sun casting a warm glow over his features. Miles caught himself staring again, and this time, Dylan didn't look away. "You don't talk much," Dylan said softly as the others admired the view. "At least, not to me." Miles hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm here to make sure everyone's safe and has a good experience. That's my job." Dylan's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Doesn't mean you can't enjoy yourself too." Miles didn't respond. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a tension that neither of them seemed willing to break. The moment stretched on until one of the other monitors called for the group to head back. Dylan lingered for a beat longer, his gaze holding Miles's, before finally turning to leave. As they made their way back to camp, Miles replayed the interaction in his mind, questioning every word, every glance. He knew he was walking a fine line, but he couldn't deny the truth. Dylan wasn't just another camper. There was a connection between them, unspoken but undeniable, and it was only growing stronger with each passing day. The days at Camp Riverbend passed in a steady rhythm of activities and responsibilities, but for Miles, every moment felt charged with a tension he couldn't shake. Dylan was always nearby, whether by chance or design, and their interactions grew increasingly layered with unspoken meaning. Miles told himself to focus on his job, to treat Dylan as he would any other camper, but it was impossible when every glance, every word exchanged felt like a step closer to something forbidden. One afternoon, Miles found himself leading the group through a kayaking session on the camp's serene lake. The air was warm, the sun reflecting off the water in shimmering waves. As the campers paddled out, Miles stayed on the shore, keeping watch and offering guidance. But then Dylan, as if drawn by some invisible thread, paddled his kayak closer to where Miles stood. "Beautiful day, huh?" Dylan called out, his voice carrying easily over the water. Miles nodded, keeping his tone neutral. "Perfect weather for kayaking." Dylan leaned back in his kayak, his golden hair glinting in the sunlight, his blue eyes fixed on Miles with an intensity that made the older man's pulse quicken. "You should join us sometime. Bet you'd leave us all in the dust." Miles chuckled softly, his professionalism warring with the warmth spreading through his chest. "I'll stick to watching for now. Someone's got to make sure you all stay safe." Dylan's smirk widened. "Always watching, huh? Guess I feel safer already." The comment was light, but it carried a weight that Miles couldn't ignore. He turned away, pretending to check on another camper, but he felt Dylan's gaze linger on him long after their conversation ended. The rest of the session passed uneventfully, but the memory of Dylan's words stayed with Miles as they returned to camp. That evening, the campers gathered around the fire pit for a storytelling session. Miles took his usual place on the edge of the group, observing rather than participating. Dylan sat across the circle, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. Every so often, their eyes would meet, and the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. As the stories wound down and the campers began to disperse, Dylan lingered by the fire. Miles stayed too, his feet rooted to the ground despite his better judgment. When the others were gone, Dylan stood and walked over to him, his movements slow and deliberate. "Big guy like you, all quiet over here?" Dylan teased, his tone playful but his gaze serious. "What's on your mind?" Miles looked away, his jaw tightening. "Just making sure everything's wrapped up for the night." Dylan tilted his head, studying him. "You know, you're not as hard to read as you think." Miles's chest tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" Dylan smiled softly, his voice lowering. "It means I see you, Miles, and I think you see me too." The words hung in the air, a dangerous truth neither of them could fully acknowledge. Miles opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Dylan's expression softened, and for a moment, Miles thought he might step closer, but instead, Dylan turned and walked away, leaving Miles standing alone by the dying fire. That night, as Miles lay in his tent, the weight of their interaction pressed down on him. He knew he should create distance, establish boundaries, but how could he when every fiber of his being yearned to be closer to Dylan? The connection between them was undeniable, and with each passing day, it grew harder to ignore. Miles closed his eyes, his mind filled with images of Dylan's smile, the way his eyes sparkled in the firelight. For the first time in years, Miles felt something awaken inside him, something powerful, intoxicating, and impossible to resist. And deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before everything changed. The camp had settled into a quiet rhythm as the first week drew to a close. The days were filled with activities and laughter, but for Miles, every moment was marked by the lingering tension between him and Dylan. Their connection had only deepened with every glance, every passing word, until it felt like a fire burning just beneath the surface, waiting to break free. Miles kept himself busy, throwing himself into his responsibilities and avoiding unnecessary interactions with Dylan. But no matter how much distance he tried to create, Dylan always found a way to close the gap. It was as though the younger man had made it his mission to be near Miles, testing his resolve with every smile, every sly comment. That night, as the campers retired to their tents, Miles stayed back to clean up the fire pit. The campgrounds were quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. He was lost in thought, the cool night air doing little to calm the heat inside him, when he heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Miles turned, his heart skipping a beat as he saw Dylan standing a few feet away. The younger man was dressed in a simple t-shirt and shorts, his golden hair slightly tousled, his blue eyes fixed intently on Miles. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "Couldn't sleep," Dylan said softly, taking a step closer. "Thought I'd take a walk and saw you out here." Miles straightened, his hands tightening around the poker he'd been using to stoke the fire. "You should be in your tent, Dylan. It's late." Dylan shrugged, his gaze never wavering. "I could say the same to you. But here we are." There was something in his tone, playful yet serious, that made Miles's pulse quicken. He glanced around, ensuring they were alone, before taking a step back. "Go on, now. Don't make this complicated." Dylan's expression softened, and he took another step closer. "Maybe it already is. Maybe it's been that way since the moment we met." Miles opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat as Dylan closed the distance between them. The younger man's eyes searched his, daring him to deny what they both knew was true. Miles's chest tightened, his instincts screaming at him to walk away, but his feet refused to move. "I see the way you look at me," Dylan whispered, his voice low and filled with emotion. "And if you think I don't feel the same, you're wrong." The confession hit Miles like a bolt of lightning, his resolve crumbling under the weight of Dylan's honesty. He looked away, his jaw tightening, but Dylan reached out, his hand brushing against Miles's arm. The touch was gentle, but it sent a shockwave through Miles's entire body. "You have to go," Miles said finally, his voice strained. We can't." Dylan stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Fine, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Miles standing alone by the fire. The older man let out a shaky breath, his mind racing with what had just happened. He knew he was playing with fire, but the flame was impossible to ignore. Later that night, as Miles lay in his tent, he couldn't shake the memory of Dylan's words, the look in his eyes. The line he'd been so careful not to cross was becoming blurrier by the second, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could resist the pull. It was then, as his thoughts spiraled, that he heard the soft sound of his tent zipper being pulled. His heart leapt into his throat as the flap opened, revealing Dylan standing there, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "Miles," Dylan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't stay away." Miles sat up, his breath catching in his chest. The moment he'd been dreading and longing for was finally here, and there was no turning back. Miles froze as Dylan stepped inside the tent, the younger man's presence filling the small space with an energy that was both thrilling and terrifying. The dim light of the lantern cast soft shadows across Dylan's face, highlighting his sharp jawline and the intensity in his blue eyes. He knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, as if giving Miles time to stop him. But Miles didn't. He couldn't. "You shouldn't be here," Miles whispered, his voice hoarse, though there was no conviction behind the words. Dylan tilted his head, a soft smile playing on his lips. "And yet, here I am. You didn't stop me." The words hung heavy between them, the unspoken truth finally coming to light. Miles's heart pounded in his chest as Dylan inched closer, his golden hair brushing against his forehead as their faces drew near. Every rational thought screamed for him to put an end to this, to send Dylan away, but the magnetic pull between them was too strong. "Dylan," Miles began, his voice shaky, but Dylan cut him off with a look, a silent plea wrapped in vulnerability and determination. "I know this is complicated," Dylan said softly, his gaze locked on Miles's. "But I also know what I feel when I'm around you. You're not just some camp monitor to me. You're something more." Miles swallowed hard, his defenses crumbling under the weight of Dylan's words. "This isn't right. There are rules." "Rules don't mean anything when it's real," Dylan countered, his voice firm yet tender. "And I know you feel it too. Don't tell me I'm wrong." Miles couldn't. The truth was written all over his face, in the way his body leaned toward Dylan's despite his better judgment, in the way his breath hitched when their eyes met. Without another word, Dylan closed the gap between them, his lips brushing against Miles in a kiss that was as soft as it was explosive. The world seemed to fall away in that moment, leaving only the two of them tangled in a web of desire and emotion. Miles' hands found their way to Dylan's waist, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened, growing more passionate with every passing second. Dylan's touch was electrifying, his fingers tracing the contours of Miles's broad shoulders and chest with a mix of curiosity and reverence. Their movements were unhurried but charged, each touch and kiss a silent exploration of the feelings they'd kept bottled up for days. Dylan's lips trailed along Miles's jawline, his breath warm against his skin, as Miles let out a soft groan, his resolve completely shattered. For hours, they stayed locked in their bubble of intimacy, sharing whispered confessions and stolen kisses. Dylan's laughter filled the tent as Miles teased him about his boldness, and Miles's deep chuckle echoed in response when Dylan playfully called him out for his initial reluctance. The connection between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional, raw, and undeniably real. But as the night wore on and the first rays of dawn began to creep through the edges of the tent, the weight of reality started to settle in. Miles lay on his back, staring at the canvas ceiling as Dylan rested against his chest, his breathing slow and steady. The younger man looked peaceful, content, but Miles' mind was racing. "This can't happen again," Miles said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Dylan stirred, lifting his head to meet Miles' gaze. "Why not? You know how I feel." "I know how you feel?" Miles sighed, his hand brushing against Dylan's cheek. "Because it's not just about us. There are rules, expectations. This is bigger than what we want." Dylan's expression hardened, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "I don't care about the rules. I care about you." Miles's heart ached at the sincerity in Dylan's words, but he knew the world outside their tent wouldn't be as forgiving. "We'll figure it out," he said, his tone soft but firm. "But for now, this has to stay between us." Dylan nodded reluctantly, leaning in to press a final kiss to Miles's lips before slipping out of the tent. As Miles watched him disappear into the early morning light, a mix of longing and fear settled in his chest. They had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The question now was how far they were willing to go to hold on to what they'd found. The morning after their shared night, Miles woke to the sound of campers bustling outside, their laughter and chatter filling the air. He sat up in his tent, his thoughts clouded with the weight of what had happened. The memory of Dylan's touch, his voice, and the way his blue eyes had looked at him with unwavering conviction lingered in his mind. It was intoxicating, but it also came with a harsh realization: things couldn't go back to how they were. Miles stepped out of his tent, forcing himself into the rhythm of the day. He greeted the other monitors and helped coordinate the morning's activities, all while keeping his eyes averted from Dylan. The younger man, however, made no effort to hide his presence. He moved through the camp with his usual confidence, his gaze occasionally meeting Miles's in fleeting moments that sent a jolt through his chest. During the midday activity, a hike to a nearby waterfall, Dylan managed to position himself near Miles. The older man tried to focus on guiding the group, but he could feel Dylan's eyes on him, watching his every move. When the group paused for a break, Dylan approached, his voice low enough that only Miles could hear. "Are you going to avoid me all day?" Dylan asked, his tone teasing but edged with genuine curiosity. Miles shot him a warning glance, his jaw tightening. "This isn't the time or place." Dylan smirked, leaning against a nearby tree. "You're really good at pretending, you know that? But I know what's going on in your head." Miles's chest tightened. He glanced around, ensuring no one was paying attention, before stepping closer to Dylan. "You need to stop," he said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "If anyone sees us?" "Then don't let them," Dylan interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "You keep pushing me away, but we both know you don't want to." Before Miles could respond, one of the campers called out, breaking the tension. Miles turned back to the group, his heart pounding as he resumed his role, but Dylan's words echoed in his mind. challenging the carefully constructed walls he'd tried to maintain. As the day wore on, the weight of their secret grew heavier. Miles found himself replaying every glance, every word, every stolen moment between them. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Dylan, but the risk loomed over him like a storm cloud. What if someone found out? What if this thing between them spiraled out of control? That evening, Miles stayed behind after dinner to clean up, hoping to clear his head. The camp was quiet, the stars beginning to peek through the night sky. He was lost in thought when he heard footsteps approaching. Turning, he saw Dylan standing there, his expression unreadable. "I don't regret what happened," Dylan said, his voice steady. "But I need to know where we stand." Miles sighed, running a hand over his face. "Dylan, it's complicated. I can't. It's only complicated because you make it that way." Dylan interrupted, stepping closer. "I'm not asking for promises or forever. I'm asking for honesty. Do you feel what I feel, or am I imagining it?" Miles stared at him, the walls he'd built crumbling under the weight of Dylan's words. "You're not imagining it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this can't happen, Dylan, it's too risky." Dylan's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of frustration in his expression. "Then what do we do? Pretend it never happened? Go back to stolen glances and silence?" Miles didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was, he didn't know what to do. All he knew was that being near Dylan was both exhilarating and terrifying, and the thought of losing him felt unbearable. As they stood in the quiet of the night, the unspoken tension between them hung heavy in the air. Dylan took a step closer, his voice soft but filled with determination. "I'm not giving up on this, Miles, not yet." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Miles alone with his thoughts and the weight of a decision he wasn't ready to make. The line they had crossed was already blurring, and the path ahead was growing more uncertain with every step. The days that followed were a careful dance of avoidance and subtle connection. Miles threw himself into his responsibilities, determined to keep a professional distance, but Dylan's presence was everywhere. Every stolen glance, every fleeting touch during group activities, ignited a fire Miles couldn't put out. The tension between them grew, an unspoken force that neither could deny nor escape. One afternoon, while leading a canoeing lesson, Miles found himself paired with Dylan. The campers had paired off, and with an odd number, Miles had reluctantly taken the last spot, next to the one person he was trying to avoid. As they paddled out onto the lake, the silence between them was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic splash of their paddles. "You're quiet today," Dylan said, his voice soft but tinged with curiosity. Miles focused on the horizon, his grip tightening on the paddle. "Just concentrating, this isn't the easiest lake to navigate." Dylan let out a small laugh, the sound light and teasing. "Come on, Miles, you've been avoiding me for days, talk to me." Miles glanced at him, his resolve wavering under Dylan's steady gaze. "There's nothing to talk about." Dylan leaned back slightly, his paddle resting on the edge of the canoe. "You're a terrible liar, you know that?" Miles sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Dylan, we can't keep doing this. It's not fair to either of us." Dylan tilted his head, his blue eyes searching Miles's face. "What's not fair is pretending this doesn't mean something. I know it scares you, but running away doesn't make it go away." Miles didn't respond, his thoughts swirling as they drifted in the middle of the lake. Dylan's words cut deep, forcing him to confront feelings he'd tried to suppress. He knew Dylan was right, avoiding the truth wasn't helping. But the risks felt insurmountable, the weight of what they were doing pressing down on him like a heavy stone. That night, as the campers gathered for another storytelling session around the fire, Miles stayed on the outskirts, his mind elsewhere. He watched Dylan from a distance, the younger man's laughter and easy charm captivating everyone around him. Miles felt a pang of longing, a pull he couldn't resist, even as he tried to convince himself to stay away. After the fire died down and the campers returned to their tents, Miles stayed behind, staring into the smoldering embers. He was lost in thought when Dylan appeared beside him, his footsteps soft against the ground. "I'm not going to push you," Dylan said quietly, sitting down next to Miles. "But I'm not going to pretend I don't feel something either." Miles turned to him, his expression conflicted. "Dylan, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to make it work." Dylan smiled softly, his hand brushing against Miles's. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just stop pushing me away." For a moment, Miles considered pulling back, retreating into his safe but lonely walls. But as he looked into Dylan's eyes, he saw something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Slowly, hesitantly, he let his hand rest on top of Dylan's, the simple touch speaking volumes. They sat together in the quiet of the night, the stars above them bearing witness to a connection they could no longer deny. For the first time, Miles allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, This summer could be something more than he'd ever imagined. But even as they shared that fleeting moment of peace, a shadow of doubt lingered in the back of Miles's mind. The summer was slipping away, and with it, the fragile bubble they'd built around themselves. What would happen when it ended? And could their connection survive the weight of the real world? Miles didn't have the answers, but for now, he held onto Dylan's hand, letting the fire of their bond burn just a little brighter. As the final days of camp approached, an unspoken tension hung in the air between Miles and Dylan. The stolen moments they shared had been fleeting, but each one carried the weight of something profound. Both of them knew the end was near, yet neither dared to bring it up. On the last night of camp, the staff organized a bonfire celebration. Laughter and music filled the night, but Miles's heart felt heavy as he watched Dylan from across the flames. The younger man looked carefree, his golden hair glowing in the firelight, but Miles could see the sadness in his eyes. When the celebration ended, Dylan approached Miles one final time. "Walk with me?" he asked, his voice soft yet pleading. They strolled in silence through the moonlit woods until they reached the lake. The water was still, reflecting the stars above. Dylan turned to Miles, his expression a mixture of longing and resolve. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Dylan said, breaking the silence. "But I want you to know. This summer meant everything to me. You meant everything to me." Miles felt his chest tighten. "You've changed me, Dylan. I'll never forget you." Their lips met in a final, tender kiss, the world around them fading away. When they pulled apart, Dylan rested his forehead against Miles's. "Next summer," Dylan whispered. "I'll come back, and maybe then." Miles nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe then." The morning of departure was bittersweet. Campers packed their bags, and buses lined up to take them home. Miles kept busy, his heart aching as he avoided looking in Dylan's direction. But as Dylan boarded the bus, he turned back, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Miles's one last time. "I'll see you next summer," Dylan said with a small smile, his voice filled with hope. Miles watched as the bus pulled away, the weight of their goodbye settling over him. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone. Dylan's words echoed in his mind, a promise that gave him something to hold on to. As he walked back to the now empty camp, Miles glanced up at the sky. The stars were still there, just as they had been the night he and Dylan first connected. He smiled, a quiet hope blooming in his chest. What do you think about this summer romance? Would you like to see what happens next summer? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how much you enjoyed this story by leaving a rating from 1 to 10.